Thank you for the wonderful music with which this started. I think those of you who were in the Stephen's Cathedral the night before last would have sensed how the Bruckner Symphony really began the way a day begins, slowly, gradually, waking up to the morning. And it's a sensation that I felt, that slow waking up every morning here in Vienna, probably, as Dagmar mentioned, also a consequence of the nights before. But that said, it was just yesterday when I was down in the hotel having breakfast and preoccupied with a couple of ideas about what I would share with you, when suddenly an apparition appeared. Some of you may be familiar with the book The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, where he writes that he was trying to repair his aeroplane, and suddenly this young figure appeared before him. And we were at the Hotel de France, which makes it opposite. I suddenly saw this figure, and in the book, actually, the figure asks the pilot, "Please, can I draw you a sheep?" And this young figure looked at me and said, "Please, can I give you an acronym?" And handed me an iPhone. And there, what I had been struggling with for 2 nights and the best part of that morning suddenly materialized. Vienna, visionary, innovative education, nurturing new academics. So I looked up to thank the little prince, but Tatsuro was gone. So thank you so much, Tatsuro, for that and for setting the tone for this cafe today. This is a remarkable hall, the ceremonial hall, for 2 reasons. One, it's a hall of alliances. Alliances in the sense of political agreements, security agreements, but much more important, and I think this is going to be reflected in our conversations this morning, of personal alliances. It was in this room in 1810 that Napoleon came to Emperor Franz I and asked for the hand of his daughter, the Archduchess Marie-Louise, in marriage. Again, this is the hall where, to go back to our acronym, new minds were nurtured. And they were nurtured really by literally walking upon and tending the souls of the old. Every year, the later Emperor Franz Joseph I and his wife Elizabeth used to come here, and lined up on the floor before them sat 24 elderly men and women. And the emperor and his wife used to wash their feet, a sign of reverence from the young to the old. A spirit that continues in IUP. I saw it at first hand last evening when Hetor walked across the room with a chair for a young lady. So that idea of reverence, of respect, is something which is ingrained in the marble and the chandeliers that we see before us today. We're also, in many senses, at a remarkable time. When you think of 2017, it's been 100 years since the Russian Revolution, 100 years since the birth of John Kennedy, or for that matter, the birth of Indira Gandhi, 30 years since Alvaro Romo first became Secretary General of IUP. So, in all these anniversaries, it's sometimes difficult to distill the 2 important elements which I think we should think of today. And I would put these firstly as friendship, and the second as compassion. And when we think of science, of young scientists and the potential they bring, it's all too easy to be intimidated by the titles of the papers and the abstracts that we see before us. But let's go back to the giants who brought us here. Let's go back to what Michael Adams once said, how this generation possesses both the technological savvy and the sense of human understanding to make it a generation of change. Another one of our giants who happily is present with us today, Mark Harris, once remarked about the area between the brain and the heart where hope lies. Those are the lessons, I think, that the last 2 days have brought to us. Because no matter how precise the data or the quantification, and this, in a sense, is the mission of IUP, it is so easy for all technological progress to be completely undone in a matter of weeks, in a matter of days, in a matter of hours. I talked of 1917 in an article in our flagship publication, the UN Chronicle, some years ago. Toyoshi Sato spoke about the first 10 years of the 20th century, the rapid pace of technological progress, how in 1902, Reginald Fessender had created the radio waves that brought communication to a wholly new level. How a year later, in 1903, the Wright brothers began to pilot aviation. And how, in 1908, Henry Ford launched his Model T car. But that was the first decade, and then look at what happened in the second decade. The First World War, the cruelties, the annexations, the spreading of colonialism. So all that was undone. And let's not make the mistake of thinking that the technological progress that we have at hand today is unprecedented or new. It's only the scale and the opportunities that are new. But think of it. When Gutenberg first created the printing press, within 50 years, 8 million books had been printed. Think of that as an indicator of our capacity as human beings to be able to, in Neil King's wonderful phrase, to seize the extraordinary. If we are able to seize the extraordinary and to make it part of our mission and our lives, then we come back to the two principles that I have tried to suggest to you. Dagmar, who was gracious enough to introduce me, has spoken about unilateral friendships and reciprocal friendships. It's a fascinating thought, but I would venture to go further, saying that a unilateral friendship will inevitably become a reciprocal friendship, whether it is between individuals, whether it is between communities, whether it is between scientific peers, and indeed, as the United Nations, I think, has proven, whether it is between nation states. The idea of making that gesture, of stepping forward, will inevitably be reciprocated. And that, again, is the whole idea of what Michael called the bridges and what the 2014 triennial in Yokohama called the future of higher education. Lavan Samuels, who is a dentist by profession, once told me that when he was growing up, he had T-shirts saying, "Dentists build bridges in society." But that said, I think we have to also realize that the idea of that bridge begins when one stone is put forward on one bank with the idea of reaching the other bank. And if you extend that metaphor, the further you go building that bridge from the bank that you're on, the longer it will take. But if you begin on the second bank as well, then you are able to create that bridge in a space of far briefer time. This, to my mind, is what the Young Scientists Conference is all about. Because you've had a vigorous exchange of ideas. You've had a creation of new opportunities. Because what happens today is that no matter what the field of study that your students go to, ultimately they will be able to chart their life's course not by the subject they have learned, but the quality of education you have brought. Kaha Shengalia mentioned to me how the most successful students in the School of Global Governance at Caucus University were successful because they set up something called Ice and Rolls, a basic combination of bagels and ice cream. What has that to do with global governance? Perhaps nothing. But the fact that that education allowed them to acquire that measure of self-confidence, ingenuity, and I dare say, technological and scientific innovation. And then we come back to the second question of compassion and how this ultimately will underlie the degree to which our scientific capacities can be nurtured and, to go back to Tatsuro's phrase, the new academic can emerge. Today, when this continent in particular is facing an overwhelming refugee crisis, who are the people who have made it easier for the children, the women and the men who are fleeing borders and seeking refuge? It is young scientists. We have today 20 apps devised by people like you who have created the opportunity for refugees to talk to each other, build communities, communicate with authorities, seek healthcare, seek provisions, all of that at the touch of a finger. But again, this is something which is not unique to this generation. In the late 1950s, a 19-year-old, David Deegan, ran the New York Marathon. And at the end of the marathon, he suddenly realized that by the time he was able to get back into his clothes, he had already suffered a chill and could quite conceivably suffer hypothermia. And so he thought and said, what can we do? And he came across an insulated material, which he then realized he could market and give runners as they had reached the finish line so that they would immediately protect themselves in that interval before they were able to get their clothes on. Fast forward 5 years later, what this 19-year-old thought of for marathon runners in New York, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Agency in the United States, took over as a shield for its spacecraft when they shot into unfamiliar temperatures and territories. So the tradition of ingenuity has always been there with the generation we're about to hear today. But my argument or my proposition is that that ingenuity has a tremendous danger now of retreating into either commercialism or insularity. As young people, and as young people become less young and grow further, they would become more and more tempted to realize that the privacy that electronics gives them, the opportunity for seclusion and research that your universities give them, all of that can be an incubator for precisely the values that this organization, this association, was created to foster, precisely a vehicle to deny those values, the values of friendship and compassion. And I think this is where the idea of university as a home, as Don Betts said, for stellar achievement, the idea of creating a universe rather than merely the quality of education in itself is so vitally important. And we have a tremendous 3 years ahead of us because in 2020, we are going to be again commemorating so many punctuation marks. It'll be 1/3 of the way down to the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we do not realize by then the track we are on, if our new academics cannot foresee what needs to be done in the 10 ensuing years to keep us on track or to exceed that track, then we risk failure. It's going to be 75 years since the United Nations came into being, a chance for the United Nations, through minds and hearts like yours, to go back to its roots of we the peoples rather than we the nation states. It's going to be 55 years of the IUP, 55 years of, yes, innovation, yes, of sustainability, because these are not unique to our age or our time. And when we extend that idea still further, we come to the conclusion that an association of university presidents is exactly that, an association of individuals, where the idea of trust, where the idea of sharing, where the idea of what Jason Scosa calls civic friendship can endure. Because that friendship, if we are able to communicate that, we avert what again, if I may quote Hathor some years ago, we avoid the dangers of the social bomb that is slowly being built in our midst. The power of education lies, and I would like to state perhaps the obvious, lies not in fact or research or discovery. Those are consequences of, not the definition of education. The definition of education, as IUP has always held, is to summon the best possible in each woman and each man and put that together for the collective good. But it has to begin one person at a time. This has been my greatest debt of gratitude to this association. The fact that we have been able to make our achievements as an association one person at a time. And I think we will discover in the course of this morning, as we come to this young cafe, that that same spirit animates the younger hearts and minds who are with us today, because they have reached out across languages, across disciplines, across cultures, with essentially one theme in mind, that there has to be compassion and reverence, not only for the world we share, but more important, for the people with whom we share that world. Thank you for that. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to hearing you. Thank you very much.